I'm reading from a story that I wrote in 2011 that was published in Serving Him, Sexy Stories of Submission, an anthology that was curated by Rachel Kramer Bussel, and I'll put a link to how you can purchase the book. And you can actually buy signed copies via my website if you'd like me to sign a copy for you. And I'm going to read the story tonight, or today, depending on when you're watching. It's called Breath. The man I serve is not Prince Charming of my childhood fantasies. Neither is he the dominant I conjured up from my fevered imaginings whence I uncovered the buried bunker that was my submissive self. He is, in fact, very fucking far from those imaginary beings. What I sought was someone near me, someone single, also monogamous, available to be part of every facet of my life. Instead, I landed feet first and stunned out of my right mind by a man who was quite polyamorous, already happily married, and most of the continent away from where I lived. My brain and my powers of rational reasoning were sure that this was a situation that would never ever take root, that it was impossible outside of my desires, a terrible compromise. His smile, his confidence, and the way he silenced the chorus of naysayers in my head within moments of pushing me into a corner and whispering into my ear turned the tide. His voice, cinnamon, molasses, burnt honey, and twilight, calmed me into relaxing my guard a bit, just a bit. But that was all he needed. I found myself a shaking, loose-limbed rag doll, glazing unblinking into the depths of his eyes, green and sparkling and dangerous and delicious, and I knew that saying no to him was simply not an option, and never would be. In our play, he was always very personal. Though skilled with a whip and a cane, and handy with rope and restraints and all manner of sharp, shiny danger, he preferred to use his hands. I like to know it is me hurting you. His voice slipped into my head and elicited my own slow smile, because I enjoy that direct control far, far more than having an implement between us. Agreed. His hands are, after all, so expressive and so descriptive. The first time I found his hands around my throat, I had a combined sensation of arousal and panic. I have a rather negative reaction to my breathing being cut off that way. It causes an immediate headache and blinding pain. The first time this happened, he immediately went into triage mode to ensure I was okay. Submitting to an ER nurse has its upside. Deciding that the risk wasn't worth it, he moved on to other excruciating torments, and let me tell you, nurses can be some sadistic motherfuckers, which is also an upside, as far as I'm concerned. Since our relationship is long distance, the times when we do see each other feels heightened. There's so much to balance, his wife, other partners, and the brevity of our time together served to add weight and urgency to every encounter. So when I was able to see him again after some absence and look forward to playing with him, every aspect of my emotional, physical, and mental selves were poised and sharpened. This particular event was held, as so many kink events are, in a hotel. I found myself on the floor in a play space that had been assembled thanks to the labor and intentions of a close-knit group of people who run the event. My dominant is one of them, and so taking time off from the work of running the event to stop and play is a precious connection indeed. There isn't anything particularly special about a hotel ballroom, and there sure as hell wasn't anything special about the hideous carpeting in said ballroom. But there is magic when you realize that you are being pushed into the aforementioned hideous carpet and you feel every inch of skin being abraded against it as you writhe on the floor trying to breathe. I was past coherency. I didn't think about anything clearly except how it was becoming more and more difficult to inhale. I was surprised to learn that my previous issues with breath play had been neatly circumvented. I was aroused to see him smiling at me calmly as I struggled for breath. How did I wind up in a breath play scene? Why can't I breathe? He isn't choking me. What's happening? Oh, God. This did not start out as a breath play scene at all. It started out with one of my favorite toys, a flexible handled cat o' nine tails. A thready whip will get my attention every time. We'd started out with a silly opening to our scene, a playful teasing series of orders to strip, which I obeyed with a faux reluctance, a wink and a smile. The long crimson and saffron scarf that floated about my shoulders wound around my throat as I found the other end of it wound around his hand, but of course he wouldn't strangle me with it. That was off the table. Warm-up consisted of the whip finding its flicker-tongued way across the backs of my thighs, eliciting sighs and squeals alike from me. But there was an odd impermanence to the rhythm, and before long he'd put down the whip in favor of availing himself of my pain with his hands. Fair enough, I thought, since his hands are fairly fucking formidable. This thought was followed by my wailing scream as he dug his fingers deep into the big muscles of my thighs, fingers pushing with an insane force into the crease where my hip socket hid within muscle and tendons, pushing me to the place where speech becomes an eel in my mouth and I can't quite manage words, stuttering and spitting syllables to beg for what? Mercy? It is a fucking laugh, because when I start to feel that real pain, when I can see him observing the edges of my composure fraying, it is just getting good. And mercy simply isn't in the cards. I was hiccuping and writhing away from him, trying to escape the thrumming pain in my muscles as he squeezed, compressed, and pulled them to places where my wordless verbalizing became a stream of shouts and moans, and I think if you'd been there and closed your eyes, you might have thought you were in the front row of church in the amen corner of your friendly neighborhood Pentecostal sermon, except I wasn't trying to pretend that the ecstasy and the surreal glossolalia were due to anything but unrelenting pain and protracted torment at the hands of someone I trusted completely. And as the pain became more intense, my body's energy and the charge around pain focused it to a shaking climax that racked me again and again and again as I felt myself break apart and resolve into a heaving, panting, orgasmic response. And then my hiccuping breath escaped me and failed to return. I tried to inhale and found myself strangely desperate for breath, not in a wheezy, asthmatic kind of way, not in that stabbing pressure to my head strangulation way. I just couldn't inhale, and I couldn't figure out why. I blinked and connected solidly with him as he observed my face, looking into my eyes and no doubt seeing my confusion. He leaned in closer to me, and I realized then that I couldn't breathe properly because his arm was between us, aligned underneath my breast, compressing my rib cage evenly. No pain, no muss, no fuss, but I couldn't fucking breathe. I put my hand against his chest, at first with a sort of pleading flutter rather than roughly pushing him away, and he backed off. For a moment. I caught my breath and took in as much air as I could, only to feel him leaning in again, face inches away from mine, and I could feel my heart squirming in my chest, lungs shuddering, diaphragm confounded in its standard action. My body had been doing this job for just over 42 years, and hadn't previously encountered an external force that bothered to interfere with it in this way. But here it was, and there he went, pressing again with a force that was almost gentle and didn't hurt. Not really, but terrified me all the more because I felt my vision narrowing and a small, white, hot panic blossomed behind my eyes. I'd only felt this type of diminishing of my faculties once before, and that was a very bad moment. I had feared then that I might be dying, and now that same genie erupted from the bottle, and the thought occurred to my confused mind that the logical result of him continuing on the path we were currently exploring was my suffocation. I shoved against him as hard as I could, gaining another lungful of air and another opportunity to vent my slipstream of confusion as I watched him watching me, and he permitted me the struggle, so I twisted away and dragged myself a few feet before he brought me back and pulled me over and under him and pushed down on me again, and I sobbed. Shaking, I felt my chest relax, strangely, as he leaned in again and pushed. And again. And again. The cycle of resistance was winding down. I was drained, and impossibly aroused. Even as I whined and suffocated, my cunt was wet. With a shift in his leg, he pressed himself more closely to me. I could feel his cock and knew my suffering was feeding him too. Even as I was dimming, he was feeding, and I luxuriated in being drained and trapped in his eyes as I watched him watch me fading, saw his eyes dilate even as my eyes drifted shut, and I moaned. My hand no longer pushing him away, but instead resting on his arm. I let go. It did not hurt, and my panic had died into a sweet terror. Not of him, though. I wondered what it might be like to have the last thing I saw be his eyes on mine, that barely visible smile, lips parted to inhale the last wisps of breath that escaped mine. I lost my desire to fight. In that moment, I remember one thought, swimming upward from the murky depth of my consciousness, the thought that I did not need to fight him. Fighting him was not what I wanted, never what I wanted. What I wanted was to graciously, gratefully endure what he gave me, and I gave him that. My wordless pleas again becoming manifestations of the slippery, beautiful terror. I was so totally his that I let go of myself and gave myself to him, and there was nothing at all in those moments that would have driven me to assert my will against his. Not even my will to breathe. The heat of his gaze as he took in my acquiescence, my submission to this torment suffused me, his energy surging even as mine ebbed, and oh, such sweetness. Then I was breathing again, and then I was in his arms, safe from him, safe with him. Then there were tears, and then there was more. Then I lacked words and took his hand in my hand and pressed his hand to my lips over and over again. I crawled up and knelt at his feet, sobbing and wet and shaken, and his. Everything I could say about those moments, that conversation we had without words, all of it sounds like hyperbolic histrionics. There are ways, and there are ways that power exchange manifests. Manifesting power to give control of my autonomous functions to another human being, and to do so voluntarily. To look into the eyes of another person and give him everything is a sweet emotional narcotic, and I'm fully addicted. And that's the end of that story. Thanks for listening.